Andrew, you can take it away if you want to share.
Okay. So am I driving that presentation or do I need to pull it up?
I was expecting you to have your own deck. I can drive if you want.
Oh, okay. I could pull that up. I just didn't know how we were doing that part.
If you want, I've got the slide. So
all right, I'll just let you drive then. Welcome everybody. My name's Andrew Statler. I am a co-chair in the structured documents working group, and I'm also a member of the CDA management group. I am a director at Cerner Corporation, and I work in our development IP organization, and we do a lot of the CDA development. So I'm very closely involved in a lot of the development there. One of the things that I wanted to touch base on and talk a little bit about today is something that I think could benefit all of us, and that's talking about how we could do more to incorporate use cases when we build our implementation guides in the C-CDA space. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide then. So there's two different projects that we've been working on at Cerner in the last couple of years, and both of them are using one of our standards that we created out of the structured documents space. Well, not necessarily just structured docs, because this is also the public health space, but it's the EICR, so the initial case reporting. But it has structured docs as a like a co-sponsor type. But if we look at the actual implementation guide, the initial implementation of it is pretty broad in general. And when we went out and we first started working on this a few years ago, it was a project related to Digital Bridge, and many of you on the call may be even involved or have heard of the Digital Bridge project. We're trying to actually submit various types of information to public health reporting agencies based on conditions, and the idea was that if a patient presented and they had met certain criteria based on different codes that popped up. So whether it was a DRG, or whether it was a specific lab test, or a specific CPT code. So it could have been diagnosis related. It could have been any kind of lab value that they had. So there was a lot of different criteria that could trigger this. But in any case, if one of these triggering criteria occurred in their history, that a CDA would be created and it would get sent off to a public health reporting agency. It ended up making this implementation somewhat difficult for us. And I can't necessarily speak to other vendors and what the experience was like for them, but I can speak to what it was like for us and some of the partners that we worked with from a client perspective. We spent well over a year, almost year and a half, working with some of our partners trying to get this off the ground, because the triggering process was difficult. We would spend time trying to get this triggered manually, just to be able to do like a proof of concept once we actually identified the content and the structure of the CDA that was supposed to be there. And then there was the submission aspect of it. How were we going to submit it? Was it going to be some sort of direct submission? Was it going to use i.e. the direct protocol? Was it going to go through some sort of network? How is it going to be passed? And so there was also issues around content. There were certain pieces of data that we didn't necessarily have at the time, but there was a request to go ahead and get these CDAs out, and so some stuff started to become optional. Some stuff became that was required no longer became required. It went to recommended, and it became this really hazy, unclear concept that we spent many cycles just iterating on, and never actually got this to a production state. And I want to contrast that with another implementation of the very same standard, basically, where we had earlier this year with the COVID stuff, an opportunity to use the initial case reporting for our COVID, in which case we needed to submit COVID cases to the government. And when we had more specific criteria with that, more specific criteria with that use case, and we had a very specific means for how to transmit that, we were able to create a prototype and actually show that we could do that in a matter of days. So that was quite the night and day situation for us from a vendor and a development perspective, thus showing the value of a good, well-defined use case, at least from our perspective. So if we go to the next slide. Part of that comes back to a point of, at what point, does that standard start to become becoming like a standard? I personally, I was in the field doing implementation type work at Cerner before I came into the world of development, and we had been doing a lot of that development for meaningful use stage 2. Where'd my slide go?
Slides back.
Yeah, thank you. Lost my train of thought there for a second while I was doing that. I used to do a lot of development for the meaningful use stage 2, meaningful use stage 3. Added the additional document templates, and we added the health national healthcare standard templates. We started creating care plan templates for multiple solutions in the EICR. But in between that, we also had a lot of errata releases and cleanup for the scorecard to make usability better. But when we're doing a lot of that, it seems like we're iterating on these standards and correcting the things that we're finding in the field as we're actually trying to implement rather than basing it on a specific use case or a specific implementation that we know how it's supposed to work. You know, when we've done the initial build or initial design of some of these standards, sometimes we're trying to build exactly to what's laid out in the implementation guide or in the base standard, without necessarily knowing how it's going to be used. And so we go create this product and we test it based on what we think or what our interpretation is of that particular standard, and we go put that out to our clients to actually go start testing and using it. And when they then are implementing with another partner, if they're implementing with another Cerner partner, it's probably going to work just fine because they're both doing it the same way. But if they start implementing it with a non-Cerner partner, like another vendor, depending on how that other vendor has interpreted it, we get to that point of, hey, they interpreted that use case a little bit differently or came up with a slightly different interpretation. And now we get into this push-pull of, okay, we didn't interpret it that way. We did something different. And that's when we start getting into this push-pull of, okay, well, now we need to do this, so we need to do that. And that's when we start having to do all these multiple iterations of development on one of these standards in order to actually get it to the point that it is a usable product. And what's really, it can be really frustrating with some of these is that they may be published as a standard and then quickly adopted into regulation, and we have to go implement it as a regulatory requirement before we truly have adopted what the use case or how it should be implemented from vendor to vendor, and it may not be quite ready for prime time. Can we go ahead and advance to the next slide? So again, in my electronic case reporting, I mentioned we started 2 years ago. It was actually over 2 years ago at this point. We developed our EICR, and we were working with 2 of our clients. And so one of our clients was using the solution we developed, and we were iterating with them. Another one was Intermountain. They actually developed their own solution. And so they were taking a slightly different approach, but they were also trying to iterate through the same set of challenges that we were iterating through with their own developed solution. So I know that they were having similar challenges to us as we were going through this, because we were having weekly conversations with their team and our team as we were trying to implement this. And for over a year, as we were having these conversations with them, we were struggling to try and get them into a live environment. Part of what we were having to do is download a file with the updates that had, all of the SNOMED CT values, all of like the DRG, values, all of the CPT codes, all the ICD-10s, and all the lab values, that would be like the link codes that would be used as triggers for everything in the system. That means that not only do we have to pull all of that down, but it then has to be referenced into the client's local values so that the client can the client can actually then relate that into their data and use that as triggers to pull that information. So essentially, that disjointed solution was something that was not working as an automated solution for our clients, and we weren't able to get this to an end state after multiple passes, in a reasonable amount of time. But if we go to the next slide, we had the contact from CDC on the COVID-19 reporting. We built a new proof case for the EICR. As I mentioned, within a couple of days, we were able to actually generate a new EICR using the model for the COVID-19. And it was actually abandoning the approach that we were using for our original EICR approach. Interestingly enough, we're actually using an approach that is calling fire resources to gather the data and then puts that into a CDA format. So we built a cross-org project team that is pulling together the use case challenges. So we had to build the triggering approach still. We still needed the submission resource, but we had a clear idea of what the triggering needed to be. We needed to know we needed the team to do the submission, but we had all the specifics of what it needed to do. We also had the fire resources, so we were able to gather the exact resources that we needed to build this cross-functional team to be able to build the completed solution. We created the development team that was working on the solution, and then we're also able to define a rollout model that will allow us to roll this out for rapid deployment across our client base, rather than having something that each client would have to adopt into their local environment. We'll have a solution that will be more cloud-based for all of our clients to be able to adopt. And so this will be something that'll be easily adopted by our entire client base, and will also allow for updates to the triggering mechanism. I'll go to the next slide. So what are the implications of going to something that has more defined guidelines for like use cases? I know that when we talk about this, we're saying we're wanting to put something that's a little more exacting versus potentially limiting, innovation on the vendor side. And, it's not necessarily that we're trying to limit the innovation, but we're trying to say, put more examples of the standard use case inside the implementation guide, so that when a vendor is going to implement this particular implementation guide, the vendors have, the specifics of how this is actually supposed to be done. If it's a very broad, implementation guide, we don't have a clear idea of how it's supposed to be implemented. Our engineers, when they're going and building this stuff, they're trying to build it to the letter of the spec, and they don't necessarily know how it's supposed to be used. they are making, guesses, best guesses as to how it's supposed to be used, and they're not necessarily building it the way it's supposed to be. Excuse me. The collecting, sharing, and processing of documents, we may not always be able to be, specific on everything, but if we can at least, share the how and why, or how and when, this is supposed to be used, that goes a long way into exposing for, our builders, or those who are responsible for putting together these programs, what the standard is supposed to be doing. When we're designing it, when we're putting it together, when is this document going to be used? How is it supposed to be used? And I go on to say, to reference the SOAP model here is, if I'm building the document, and I have an idea of when this document comes into play, and I know what it's being, like when it's being used, it makes more sense to me to know that, oh, this is a CCD that's being created, early on in the process, and I don't expect it to be, a complete document, because it's only at the subjective part, for instance. Then it's okay that we don't have the full history, and we don't have all the prescription type information, because we're in the early part. And if you go to the next slide, I outline, I go back to the that more of that SOAP. Go to the next slide, John. You've got that SOAP model, right, which is subjective, objective, assessment, plan of treatment. This is not a new concept, but for engineers, sometimes that idea is new. This is something that is fairly recently new to me, that I was not really aware of, but I read this out of the the companion guide stuff, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me, right? That, hey, a basic CCD, subjective point, check-in demographics, patient states, I don't have very much at that point, and I'm creating a CCD at that point, knowing that, as a use case, okay, I don't need to have as many sections or as much information in the CCD at that point, but I also know, okay, this is the right point in processes within my system to actually trigger and create a basic CCD and send it out, versus trying to wait to send out the basic CCD, or trying to incorporate everything in that basic CCD when I send it out, and trying to make stuff up or trying to create this fancy narrative. I don't need a fancy narrative necessarily, right? And then as you do the objective, you're incorporating more information. When you get to the assessment, that's your discharge summary and your procedure notes and operative notes, right? And those come at a different point, and that you send them out at a different point. So that is a progressive model for those, but that is part of your use case potentially. Even is, where are you at in that SOAP model, and at what point are you sending those different types of notes? Even providing something as simple as that for somebody that's designing and building one of these documents, and trying to determine when and how do I use this, where do I send this out, at what point in the patient life cycle is this going to actually be triggered, can go a long way to helping define when and how they need to use it, how they need to create it, how they need to design it. It will save a lot of time from an engineer perspective, from a vendor design perspective in the long run, if they know what they need to be doing and they're not trying to create something with the level of a care plan at the point that it's really just needing a basic C-CD. Go to the next slide. There's a couple of points, just for examples. I point out healthcare associated infection. This is not necessarily a C-CDA, but it is an example of a very successful CDA product. They've had multiple releases. They've got their third normative edition is out, and they're working on their next one already. And it is very well used. Their use cases are very well defined, but it is a public health reporting situation. At the last IAT that we had in July, as I was listening to each of those different sections, I heard use cases come up again and again and again. And John DeMore was talking about life and death in the C-CDA. There was discussions about the various use cases there. Linda was talking about use cases, in the payer section. Emma was talking about various use cases in her clinical notes presentation. So there are reasons and needs for us to be discussing the use case when it comes to our implementation guides and how we actually use this. So if we go to the next slide, start bringing this, to a finish here. In our quality criteria, I just want to point out, the things that we look at for our quality from an IG perspective today. We look for the title page, the templates, inheritance and references, value sets, examples and extensions. We look at the components of the final publication package to make sure that we've got, the implementation guide, at least one file that has the sample CDA document, the extension schema, automated validation rules like the schematron and Java code. We provide validation on a website or standalone tool for templates in the IG. We can provide a test package to validate the tool as an option, but nowhere do we provide any kind of criteria for use cases as a criteria. They could be in there, but it's not a requirement. There's nothing in there as criteria today more than what's listed here. And so if you go to the next slide, what I would say is that we need to put use case as part of our implementation guides. The base standard lays out, all the basics of CDA. Our C-CDA standards lay out all the various templates, at a section, at an entry level. But I think as a member of HL7, as a co-chair in the SD working group, I would like to see us include, more on the use case is part of the criteria, and spelling out some description of that, to make sure we're providing our vendors and our user community with some idea of how is that implementation guide meant to be used, and providing them a good example use case for that particular implementation guide. If we go to the next slide, I've even provided a motion, but before we you would go consider the motion, I'd like to just go ahead and open it up for any conversation or discussion at this point.
Yes, 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 yes. I am always surprised by things that I do for our internal team that are so high level that I think the developers will be bored with the concept. And they're so grateful, because so often we throw those developers down in the weeds of move A to B, and if it's Q, do this, you know. And so every time, if they don't have the big picture, they're asking for a lot more clarification. Once they understand the use case and what it's trying to do, they can answer a lot more of their own questions about it. And we get much, I think we get much better product. And I know if anyone has been following the Da Vinci guides, the Fire Da Vinci guides, we do a lot of use case and examples in there, and explanation, so much so that we actually get pushback a lot of times that we have too much in there explaining, you know, what a quality measure is or things like that. But I would much rather err on that side than the side of here's a whole bunch of pieces, make them work.
Linda, this is Lisa. I think, you know, Da Vinci kind of got the ball rolling there, and now almost all fire IGs, in fact, the IG quality criteria that the fire management group has come up with includes this very thing. And we've seen a lot of maturation in the ability to create meaningful use case packages. I think Evelyn Gago should be given credit for really systematizing the way that use case packages get developed with a clear process around establishing personas and patient stories, and then the use cases that show how the information is intended to be shared. And without that, you know, just a sort of a focus on the content, it's not really about how information is going to move. And so, and without those expectations laid out in the IG, who knows what receivers and senders are going to understand. And so the spec doesn't really help us have a standard. So I think this is a really important consideration, and I think it's a great time, Andrew, for bringing this up, because structured documents is now in a position where their quality criteria are being reviewed. They have kind of a first draft that's available or should within days be available on their Confluence site. And a recommendation like this would have a good place to go and would immediately be able to be impactful.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think about, and you're talking about fire IGs, Lisa, I think is apt. Like if I created a fire IG that was just profiles and extensions, and I've done that in the past for other organizations where we just needed a mapping, but it's really half of an IG. Like it's here you go. If I handed that to a developer and said, here you go, here's the profiles and extensions, they'd go, great, how do I use these? And so, yeah, the Da Vinci guides that I've been working on, we have that whole end flow from, you know, even though the IG may be one part of it, we've done the whole use case and said, here, you're sending this data, and here's the spot where this IG is in the entire process flow. And then it goes out here, and then it comes back, and here again is where the IG goes. And I'm doing that with FDA as well. And so, yeah, having that in the CDA implementation guides, I think, as Andrew very well articulated in his presentation so far, would be quite helpful to people just to understand, you know, what this guide's about, how does it get triggered, how am I packaging it, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, I like what you've done here, Andrew.
Thanks.
We do have a poll. Does anyone else have any conversations? Because we do have a poll about the motion, so I can bring that up.
Yep. If anybody, if there's there's any other conversation,
need to formally make a motion to initiate this poll, so that the group could vote on this. I think it's a great idea. I'd make the motion that the IG quality criteria be updated to include specifics of one or more use cases that would be relevant for the use of the IG.
Great that you did that. Like you're making a motion, I don't think we fall under any work group or any management group. We don't have quorum of any of those. So
I think we're just making a motion with this group and a motion to take it to the structured document group at this point.
right, exactly. So
Yeah,
I-
I'll take that as a friendly amendment. That's the way we do it in the CDA Examples Task Force too. The small group that's present gets to vote to see if we're really ready and if it's something that the group stands behind to take the structured documents, and then that sort of mini vote is what initiates the conversation with structured docs.
Sure. So I've put the poll, everyone can see, we've got 10 of 20 people voting.
While people are voting, this is Dee Dee.
Yep.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Just wanted to let you guys know while everyone is voting, I also put in a link. Care quality, since this was about electronic case reporting specifically that Andrew presented, and by the way, that was an excellent presentation, Andrew. I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to the fact that there is an electronic case reporting implementation guide that Care Quality has put out specifically for COVID. It came out in June. It was fast-tracked through approval processes, and it does have use case elements in it. They may not be exactly the use case elements you're proposing, but just wanted to at least bring everyone's attention to this implementation guide that Care Quality has. Care Quality doesn't want to maintain implementation guides. We would love to give this guide over to some standard development organization to maintain going forward, but because it requires policy governance and things to be sprinkled in to it, it does include some additional items that are not just technical. So just wanted to call your attention to the fact that it does have use case information starting in Chapter 7 with actors and flows, nominal flows, and so forth.
Well, that there's a point to that too that you kind of made subtly, Dee Dee, and that is that maybe use case guides are their own thing. You know, maybe you have one or two inside of the IG general guidance, but I know within DaVinci we have, now that we start having the guides out there, people say, well, we want more use cases in there, more examples or whatever. But that means every time you put a use case in, you would have to ballot. And so there's some idea around having a different guide per se to, I don't know what the technical term is, but so that we can share those without having to redo all of the formal voting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I moved away from
modularity is really key, and I think the only struggle that we've had, and I know the fire guys have gone kind of flip-flop back and forth on this. At first, Graham wanted everything that the IG needed to be in the package, so that it was all managed together, and then we tried putting our whole use case of Gravity IG. We tried putting our whole use case package in, and then we started getting feedback that they didn't want that, and instead we should point to something that is managed separately somewhere else. So you do have that level of indirection, and I think we just need to decide on what the process will be, and then how do you nail down, if you are going to put the use case package somewhere else, you still have to version it and solidify it occasionally so that implementers know when they go to implement a certain spec, these are the 5 use cases that are in scope. And if a year later or 2 years later, 7 more use cases crop up that, that weren't even thought of before, that there's a way of knowing which use case package you were working against.
So I moved away from Zoom, and I think it closed the poll, but we'd had 17 people voted, 2 people abstained, everyone else was for, no one was against. So I think we've got that's a clear mandate from this presentation that we bring this forward to structured docs. I think both points, Andrew, that you've got here, that's what we should take back to structured docs. Not only that it should be updated to include the specifics, but they should also provide guidance on what is this criteria. And your examples are quite useful. So that will be our takeaway from this.
Yeah, I gathered that as well. And it definitely sounds like we need to define, how we do that, because sounds like we need some guidance there with respect to, how do we break that out? Is it its own guide, or is it included? And how can we provide some flexibility with that?
All right.
All right.
Do you have anything else?
I think that was all I had with the slide. Was there any other discussion there?
Wasn't Matt supposed to send us all cookies? So we'd be nice to him next section?
Let me go check my mailbox.
I didn't get mine, yeah.
Come on, you're supposed to send them to me.
Oh.
It
is break time. Go grab a cookie, 15 minutes, and then we'll have Matt Ron and Al Taylor from the ONC for our famous Ask the ONC.
Is Al on? Oh, I see him there.